With the recent successes of Lokah Chapter 1 and the upcoming release of Thama, the resurgence of vampires in Indian cinema has me completely intrigued. It made me fall into this deep rabbit hole of how vampires were actually introduced to Indian cinema and how, as with all Western ideas, we took the concept, twisted it, and gave it a completely local flavor. But here's the interesting part. Vampires may not be as Western as we think. Before Bram Stoker ever created Dracula, India already had its own versions of the undead, from Vetaal and Yakshinis to Pishacha and Brahmapurushas. The idea of vampires may have found fame in the West, but blood-sucking spirits were always a part of Indian storytelling. In our folklore, the Vetaal was a restless spirit who inhabited corpses. The Pishacha thrived on human flesh and darkness, and the Yakshini, often described as stunningly beautiful, would seduce men and drain their life source. Unlike the aristocratic cape-wearing Dracula, our monsters were born from religious rituals, folk beliefs, and the occult practices. They were deeply Indian. Raj Dusia explains in his book Indian Horror Cinema, Gendering the Monstrous, these entities weren't imported. They were shaped by our fears, our gods, and our social systems. But when cinema began picking up global ideas, the Western image of the vampire, pale skin, sharp fangs, eternal life started creeping into our screens. Let's rewind a little bit to where the modern vampire craze began. Bram Stoker's Dracula in 1897. That book turned the vampire into a gothic icon. Dark, mysterious, seductive. Then came decades of adaptations leading to the pop culture explosion of the 2000s, the Twilight Saga. Twilight made vampires mainstream again. This time, not as monsters, but as romantic heroes. The eternal love triangle of Edward, Bella, and Jacob basically defined an entire generation. It led to the flood of supernatural teen dramas like The Vampire Diaries, The Originals, and True Blood, mixing immortality, love, and danger into something strangely addictive. And honestly, that's how many of us, especially here in India, first fell for vampires. My own first introduction to vampires in Indian setting wasn't on the big screen, but on television. Pyar Ki Ek Kahani. For a lot of people, Pyar Ki Ek Kahani was India's Twilight. It aired in 2010, starred Vivian Desena as Abhay Raichand, a brooding vampire who hides his immortality, and Sukriti Kanpal as Priya, a college girl who feels a strange connection to him. The show had that same forbidden romance, gothic setting, moody color palette, and dramatic background scores. It was melodramatic, yes, but it made vampires relatable for Indian audience. Not monsters in the dark, but tragic lovers cursed by fate. In a way, it normalized vampires for the mainstream viewers, making space for future storytellers to experiment again. But vampires in Indian cinema existed long before Pyar Ki Ek Kahani. The 1978 Vayanadan Thamban, starring Kamal Hassan, brought a vampire-themed story rooted in Malayalam folklore, mixing mythology with human emotion. The movie, spanning across decades, shows Kamal Hassan character sacrificing young women for immortality. But the actual depiction of vampires was actually in the year 1979, when two films, Shaitaan Mujrim and Bhayaanak, took the cinematic stab at this genre. Shaitaan Mujrim, a scientist searching for immortality, revives a dead man, who becomes a bloodthirsty monster. The movie blends science fiction with horror, part Frankenstein, part Dracula. Bhayaanak, starring Mithun Chakraborty, takes a completely different route. A Zamindar family is advised by their guru to offer blood sacrifices for 501 moonless nights to gain wealth. The story becomes a mix of superstition, social critique, and revenge. Both films had vampires, but they were in the suave European kind. They were rooted in Indian fears, greed, power, corruption, and religion. By the 80s and 90s, something strange started to happen. The vampire figure started transforming not into something scary, but into something seductive. Films like Wo Bhayanak Raat, Bandh Darwaza, Khooni Dracula, Son of Dracula, and Shaitani Dracula, and many more turned vampires into symbols of forbidden desire and lust. Most of the stories had a similar pattern. Vampire was either feeding off women, seducing them, or it was born out of an act of sexual violence. What started as a horror slowly started to become softcore erotica. These films were low budget, often A-rated, but they kept the vampire alive, quite literally. The Ramsay Brothers, Harinam Singh, and a few others milked this genre with the over-the-top gore and sensuality. It was trashy, but in its own way, unforgettable. In 1989, Kalpana House adapted Fright Night into an Indian setting, balancing both camp and the scares. Bengali cinema too had Nishi Trishna, about a vampire born from a failed occult ritual in rural Bengal. Fast forward to 2012, Dracula 2012 took Bram Stoker's novel as inspiration, followed Roy Thomas, a man who visits Bram's castle in Romania on his honeymoon, becomes cursed, kills his bride, and returns home as a vampire. The movie wasn't perfect, but it was ambitious, showing that the vampire still fascinated Indian storytellers even after the decades of neglect. What ties all these eras together is that the vampire was never just a monster, whether it was a zamindar draining villagers in Bhayaanak, or the seductive predator in Khooni Dracula, or the cursed lover in Pyar Ki Ek Kahani. Every version reflected the same idea: power, desire, and control. Now, decades later, the vampire is rising again, but this time it's not in the shadows of cheap horror or soft erotica, it's returning as mythology. Lokah Chapter 1 shows how beautifully we can blend Indian mysticism with supernatural storytelling, while Thama promises to take that world even deeper. These stories no longer borrow from the West. They build their own lore, their own rules, their own gods and monsters. The vampire is finally Indian again, divine, tragic, and powerful. The line between folklore and fantasy is blurring beautifully. We are seeing echoes of Pishachi, Yakshini, and Vetaal all woven into a cinematic world that feels authentically Indian yet globally appealing. What was once pulp horror is slowly transforming into a rich, layered mythology again. And that's it for today. This is Talks in Progress. Thank you for watching. If you like this, please hit that subscribe button for more such content. See you next time.